Though the ontological difference is foundational to fundamental ontology, and is endorsed by Maldonado-Torres explicitly in the framing of his own exploration of the coloniality of being, it might be felt that the real upshot of his research is that this distinction needs to be rethought or even jettisoned. And that perspective tends to accord with some things Maldonado-Torres says about what he calls the topology of being. He writes that questions about space and geopolitical relations undermine the idea of a neutral epistemic subject whose reflections only respond to the strictures of the spaceless realm of the universal. And he claims that Western philosophers who, quote, adopt a universalistic perspective that does away with the significance of geopolitical location end up effectively presenting Europe as a privileged epistemic site. That's the universalizing Western particulars we've heard about in the coloniality of knowledge. Maldonado-Torres is proposing that the fundamental structure of the being of Dasein is not just the relatively superficial facticity which inflects it, varies with the cultural and geopolitical influences to which Daseins are exposed. If he's right, then earlier thinkers in the school of fundamental ontology were certainly wrong to dismiss empirical disciplines like anthropology, psychology, and biology, or indeed international relations, political economy, as providing merely ontological data with no bearing on fundamental structures of being. If he's right about this, it's precisely these empirical disciplines which one must rely on to describe, predict, and explain the variation in the fundamental structure of Dasein's being across the world. But even if he is right in that sense, it would be incorrect to view Maldonado-Torres as having made an innovation within fundamental ontology, as having moved fundamental ontology forward. If his phenomenological data really does enable him to breach the theoretical levy, as it were, which in classic fundamental ontology seals off universal, essential, a priori knowable being, if he's flooded that sealed chamber of being's fundamental structures with contingency, then the upshot of Maldonado-Torres' writings is that Daseins are facticity all the way down. So to return to a metaphor I used in connection with Heidegger, if the nature of the ingredients, the facticity, fully determines the shape of the cake mould, one is entitled to question whether the cake is baked in the mould at all. That doesn't sound like a mould. If that's how things stand, fundamental ontology is a field of study without an objective study. There's no universal, essential, a priori knowable being of Daseins, or of anything else. There's only being in a more mundane sense, a non-philosophical sense, the a posteriori observable entities that there are, and the ways they, for contingent reasons, behave. On those theoretical presuppositions, whether there is systematic variation in being understood in this more mundane way, it's not really a philosophical question. It can't be settled by transcendental argumentation or by employing the phenomenological method. Maldonado-Torres, drawing on Fanon's writings, has given us a sketch of the distinctive psychological preoccupations and proclivities which he attributes to those on the receiving end of coloniality of power. But if the being of Daseins is facticity all the way down, this sketch must be regarded as provisional, just a speculative hypothesis based on anecdote. More systematic qualitative research on the relevant populations would be required to determine whether his hunches are correct. Maldonado-Torres' coloniality of being thesis is a thesis not in, but against fundamental ontology. For this very reason, even if the coloniality of being thesis is correct, it does not add the new dimension to decoloniality theory, which it promised. If being has no universal, essential, a priori accessible dimension, but is just what there contingently empirically is, then on account of, quote, the ontological colonial difference is an account of the colonial difference, and just that. There is no philosophical dimension beyond or beneath the historical, geopolitical, social, psychological dimensions of the colonial difference discussed in Quijano and Mignolo's work, for the term ontological to be referring to. Maldonado-Torres' thesis that there is a colonial difference between groups of us at the level of fundamental ontology, it purports to add an extra dimension to decoloniality theory's analysis of the colonial matrix of power. While Quijano's coloniality of power thesis is an empirical thesis, the coloniality of being thesis promised to reveal something about coloniality at a different, deeper, metaphysical level. Given fundamental ontology's foundational ambitions, it might also have been hoped that the coloniality of being would serve as a grounding and justificatory basis for the coloniality of knowledge, which, with its cross-cutting, contradictory forms of standpoint epistemology, is an unsteady load-bearing component in the decoloniality theory edifice as things stand. And it might have been hoped that the ontological colonial difference could explain, clarify, justify the epistemic colonial difference. But I've argued today that the coloniality of being thesis doesn't add a new metaphysical dimension to decoloniality theory. It doesn't explain or justify any of the aspects of decoloniality theory which stand in dire need of explanation and justification. So if Maldonado-Torres' claims about the fundamental differences between colonized Dasein and ordinary Dasein are correct, then there are no ontological truths about Daseins available to constitute the metaphysical dimension with which it aims to furnish decoloniality theory. Now, proponents of fundamental ontology are undoubtedly going to contest Maldonado-Torres' allegations about the lived experience of these two classes of Dasein, precisely because they have those implications. But as for decoloniality theory, what I've argued is that the coloniality of being thesis leaves everything exactly as they found it.